Imagine this. You're dozing off in your cozy bed, maybe still clutching your phone, scrolling past cat videos and memes. But now, let's rewind the clock way back. Not a few decades, not a few centuries. Try 700,000 years ago. No Wi-Fi, no pizza delivery, no electric blankets, just stone tools, questionable hygiene, and a tribe so desperate, so bizarre, that they did something almost unthinkable. They cooked babies. Yeah, you heard that right. Cooked them. Not because they were following some keto diet gone wrong, but because this was part ritual, part sacrifice, part, please, angry sky, God, don't kill us with ice again. God. Now, before you bolt upright in bed, don't worry. This isn't a horror story. It's a soothing bedtime exploration, mixing dark history with a little humor, the way you might swirl honey into tea. Because if you're going to drift off to sleep while imagining ancient humans tossing babies into prehistoric crockpots, well, we might as well make it cozy, right? In tonight's story, we'll wander through the cold landscapes of early humanity. We'll meet the strange tribes who survived with rituals we can barely imagine. We'll talk about survival, superstition, and yes, stew. Along the way, I'll sprinkle in jokes, because if you're going to dream about cavemen, they might as well be funny ones. So, pull up that blanket. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. You're safe here. Your dinner is not on the menu. Let's journey into the dark, mysterious, and surprisingly hilarious world of the prehistoric tribe that sacrificed babies 700,000 years ago. The wind rolls across the ancient world, colder and sharper than anything most of us could tolerate today. It's a soundless kind of cold, the kind that eats up every other noise, until only the faint crunch of snow beneath bare, frost-cracked feet survives. Imagine lying there, wrapped in your modern blanket, and picture this. No houses, no heaters, no Starbucks pumpkin spice latte to hold between your hands. Instead, there are endless plains of scrubby grass and patches of snow, with mammoths dragging their shaggy, ice-flecked bodies across the horizon. The stars above look exactly the same as they do now, but somehow harsher, sharper, as if the universe itself was unimpressed with humanity's little experiment. 700,000 years ago, the world was not built for comfort. It was built to test, to strain, to see who or what could survive. And in the middle of this frosty theater lived a tribe. They weren't called anything you'd recognize. They didn't have a catchy brand name like Neanderthals yet. They were simply people, squat, broad, boned, with dark eyes that darted constantly, searching for predators, or food, or something in between. They had no written language, no stone monuments, no fancy myths carved into caves, just the raw, pounding immediacy of survival. Hunger gnawed at them every waking moment. The cold bit into their flesh like a relentless mosquito, except instead of a welt, it left numbness and sometimes death. Their shelters were little more than lean-tos made from mammoth bones, stacked into awkward frames, draped with hides that smelled of smoke and grease. If you've ever had to sleep in a tent that leaks when it rains, multiply that discomfort by about 10,000, and then add the awareness that a saber-toothed cat might be watching from the tree line. That was their version of home sweet home. The people huddled together constantly, both for warmth and for safety. Privacy was not a thing. Your entire family, your friends, the elderly who snored loudly, and the babies who cried, even louder, everyone lived in one smoky, cramped space. pressed up against each other, like a box of prehistoric sardines. And in this constant togetherness, decisions had to be made. When you're scraping by at the edge of extinction, the choices you make about food, about rituals, about who lives and who doesn't, they're not philosophical, they're brutally practical. The tribe's days were dictated by the hunt. A hunt was not a guaranteed victory. Sometimes it was a half-starved deer, weak from the cold, stumbling into a spear. Sometimes it was nothing at all, just footprints in snow that vanished into nothing. When food was scarce, arguments broke out. And when arguments broke out, the elders began to speak of the spirits. Ah, yes, the spirits. It's amazing how even at the dawn of humanity, we were already outsourcing our problems to invisible customer service representatives in the sky. These spirits, they said, demanded balance. They needed to be fed, and when mammoth steaks weren't enough, when rabbits disappeared, when even the roots shriveled in frozen soil, the whispers began. Perhaps, they said, the reason food was scarce was because the spirits were angry. Perhaps, they said, someone needed to give more than just a rabbit or a deer. Someone needed to give life. Now, you and I know this is tragic. You and I know this reeks of desperation. But for the tribe, this made sense. When you're clinging to existence, logic bends in interesting ways. A storm isn't just weather, it's punishment. A famine isn't just climate, it's a supernatural invoice. And so, the tribe did what humans have always done when faced with impossible odds. They invented ritual. And here's where things get dark. And oddly, darkly humorous. Because when they decided to appease their unseen sky parents, they didn't choose the big, grumpy hunters. They didn't choose Grandma, who was already yelling at clouds. No, they chose babies. The logic went something like this. Babies are pure, unspoiled, the freshest meat on the human shelf. If you wanted to impress the spirits, you gave them the best cut. And, if we're being brutally honest, in a tribe where survival was calculated in calories, babies were also the least useful. They couldn't hunt, couldn't gather, couldn't even stop drooling long enough to be helpful. So, the elders nodded grimly, and the rituals began. The sacrifices weren't daily, thank goodness. They were rare, desperate things, called upon when famine gnawed too deeply, when mothers' breasts dried up from hunger, when fathers came back from the hunt empty-handed. A child would be chosen, usually from families who had too many mouths already, and the ritual fires would be lit. The tribe would circle close, the smoke stinging their eyes. The drums well, not really drums, more like rocks, hit with sticks, beating slow and heavy. The child would be cooked, not in a gourmet way, not with rosemary or thyme, but with smoke and fire, until it became an offering, lifted by steam into the night sky. It sounds horrific to us. It is horrific. But to them, it was insurance. To them, it was hope. And in the same way you and I check our weather apps and pray the storm passes, they believed that cooking and sacrificing a child might coax the spirits into mercy. And here's where humor sneaks in. Because even in the darkest stories, absurdity exists. Imagine the prehistoric conversations. One elder solemnly declaring that the spirits must be fed, while another mutters, well, maybe the spirits would prefer we sacrificed Jerry, who still hasn't figured out how to start a fire. But no, Jerry stayed, because Jerry could at least carry sticks. Babies couldn't even hold sticks. As night fell after these rituals, the tribe would sit in silence. Smoke would hang heavy in the air. The stars would wheel overhead. and for a brief moment, they felt safe. Safe not because they had food, because they didn't. Safe not because the predators were gone, they weren't, but because they had done something, anything, to feel less powerless. And that tiny flicker of control, even if it was rooted in tragedy, kept them going. And so, as you lie here, drifting, warm, and safe, let yourself imagine their world, a cold plain, a desperate tribe, rituals born from fear. It's not comfortable, but neither is sleep when you first drift off. It takes surrender, trust, and sometimes the oddest of stories. Tonight, you're walking with them, but only as a guest, only as a dreamer. Their fears are not yours, their sacrifices are not yours, and yet, in some strange way, their desperate hope that tomorrow would be better than today still hums in your blood. That's the legacy of the tribe. The fire dies down to embers, glowing red against the darkness. In the silence, you can almost hear the whisper of snow falling outside the crude shelter. Each flake, a tiny reminder of how fragile life is in this frozen world. The tribe sleeps uneasily, wrapped in smoke-scented furs, pressed together in a tangle of limbs and exhaustion. Dreams are filled with images of mammoths, of endless hunts, of strange gods with eyes like the moon. But beneath those dreams is something darker, the echo of the ritual, the knowledge that tomorrow might demand another sacrifice. Yet life goes on. At dawn, the tribe stirs, their breath steaming in the frigid air, their bellies still empty. They rise, not with hope, but with habit. Survival is not a grand act. It's 100 small acts stacked together, repeated every day until somehow, against all odds, you're still breathing. They gather their tools, stone flakes, sharpened sticks hardened in fire. The hunters move out, their figures hunched and small against the vast horizon, while the others stay behind to tend the fire, to patch the hides that flap in the wind, to prepare for whatever the day might bring. Among them are mothers, cradling the babies who survived the night. Some look at their children with fierce love, eyes blazing against the cold. Others look with dread, aware that love alone cannot always protect. And that tension, that terrible balance between love and fear, is what defined their world. To raise a child here was not just parenting, it was gambling, betting that life would hold out long enough for the child to grow strong, to hunt, to gather, to carry the tribe forward. Food remains scarce. The animals are wary. The great herds move unpredictably, sensing shifts in climate before humans can. Days turn into weeks, weeks into seasons, and the fear returns. Fear is the heartbeat of this tribe, the constant rhythm beneath everything. And fear breeds ritual. The elders speak again, voices cracking with age, but heavy with authority. They say the spirits are restless. They say the winds carry omens. They say the fire whispers hunger. And once again, the whispers circle back to sacrifice. But it isn't as simple as tossing a baby into flames. Oh no, rituals are rarely simple. They are layered, symbolic, rich with meaning that makes sense only in the moment. The tribe paints their faces with ash, smearing black streaks across foreheads and cheeks. They mark the chosen family with soot, isolating them in a crowd, already isolated from the rest of humanity by sheer geography and time. The baby is dressed, or as close to dressed as one can get, in woven grasses, symbolic of fertility, of the hope that more life will follow. The fire is stoked higher, sparks snapping into the icy night as chants begin. Not words, not songs, but guttural sounds, half growls, half cries, rolling like thunder through the chest. And here's the strange part. There is comedy, even in this horror. Imagine someone sneezing mid-chant, breaking the rhythm, and everyone glaring at them like, "Really, Oog? You just ruined the sacred moment." Or the awkward uncle who doesn't quite hit the right pitch and ends up sounding like a dying seal. It's ridiculous, but that's what humans are. Even at the edge of extinction, even in the darkest rituals, we are clumsy, imperfect, and sometimes unintentionally funny. The ritual ends as quickly as it began. The smoke rises, the flames settle, the baby is gone. The tribe sits in silence, waiting for signs, clouds parting, winds shifting, animals returning. None of that happens, of course, because nature doesn't take bribes, but in their hearts, they believe it worked. They feel a little less powerless, a little less doomed, and sometimes belief is more nourishing than food. Back in the shelter, as the tribe settles once more into restless sleep, the mothers clutch their children tighter. Some whisper promises they cannot keep. Some sing soft, wordless songs, trying to drown out the silence that follows sacrifice. Outside, the snow continues to fall, endless, indifferent, beautiful in its cruelty. And so, the cycle continues. Hunger, ritual, survival. It is tragic, it is absurd, and yet, it is deeply human. For even in their darkest choices, the tribe was reaching for the same thing we all reach for. A tomorrow where the children we love will wake up warm, fed, and alive. The idea of a prison in prehistoric times might sound like the setup for a comedy sketch. What did they have? Tiny stone bars, a warden with a saber-toothed cat on a leash, and inmates scratching tally marks on the walls of caves. But the truth, as it usually goes in the long, strange history of humanity, was both darker and simpler. A prison wasn't a building. It wasn't a formal institution. It was whatever the tribe decided would hold you in place when you'd done something so wrong that exile wasn't an option, and instant execution wasn't convenient. The earliest prisons were pits, caves, and makeshift traps built from logs and stones. And if you've ever thought your childhood treehouse looked wobbly, just imagine a holding cell made out of half-burnt wood, lashed together with animal sinew. Imagine, for a moment, that you're accused of something. Maybe you stole food. Maybe you insulted the wrong elder. Maybe you were just too annoying after one too many fermented berry drinks. Yes, people have been getting tipsy for longer than we've had written language. Whatever the crime, the punishment was swift, and often the first step was containment. The tribe could not risk letting you roam around unchecked, because a community of 20 or 30 people simply couldn't afford chaos. So, into the pit you went. Pits were the most common. They were exactly what they sound like. Holes dug into the earth, lined with whatever the tribe could find to make escape difficult. Sometimes sharp sticks were planted upright at the bottom, less to kill you than to make sure you couldn't just climb out without serious scratches. Other times, the pit was covered with a heavy log or boulder that a couple of burly hunters would roll into place once you'd been shoved inside. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't comfortable, and it definitely wasn't cozy. The pit smelled like dirt, wet roots, and despair. If you were lucky, someone would toss down a handful of dried meat so you didn't starve before your trial, which, let's be honest, was probably just a lot of grunting and side-eyeing until someone said, "Fine, let's just beat him with sticks and get it over with." Caves were the deluxe version of prehistoric prison. Natural caves had entrances that could be blocked with boulders, brush, or carefully stacked logs. A cave cell came with the added benefit of echo. Whatever you said to protest, your innocence would bounce back at you in a very unhelpful way, like your own voice saying, "You're guilty," over and over again. And unlike modern prisons, where at least you get some yard time, a cave cell came with bats, dripping water, and possibly a hibernating bear you didn't notice until it snorted in its sleep. That made escape less appealing. Then there were log traps, wooden contraptions that doubled as both hunting tools and temporary holding pens. These were essentially giant boxes made of logs lashed together, with crude doors that fell shut once someone stepped inside. Tribes would sometimes build them for catching animals, but discovered that, hey, if it can hold a woolly calf, it can also hold Dave, who won't stop stealing mammoth marrow from the communal pot. These wooden prisons were the closest thing to furniture punishment. If you were small, you could pace around. If you were tall, your head might bump against the roof. Either way, the effect was the same: humiliation, isolation, and plenty of time to rethink your life choices. All of these early prisons were less about rehabilitation and more about buying time. They were holding spaces, a way to keep trouble contained while the tribe decided what to do. And the decision usually depended less on fairness than on practicality. Was the tribe hungry? Then the prisoner might be banished to fend for themselves, which was a slow-motion death sentence. Was the tribe angry? Then the punishment might be brutal and immediate. Was the tribe feeling generous or simply short on members? Then perhaps forgiveness would be offered, and you'd be released from your cave or pit, hopefully a little less inclined to test the group's patience again. The important thing to remember here is scale. These weren't bustling cities with thousands of people, where crime could be lost in the noise. These were tiny groups, where everyone knew everyone, and one wrong move could affect the entire survival equation. So, their prisons, crude as they were, mattered. They were symbols of order, even if that order looked a lot like a hole in the ground. And while you lie in your comfortable bed now, picture how terrifying it must have been to hear the scrape of a log rolling over the cave entrance, sealing you in with nothing but your own thoughts, your guilt, or maybe your outrage, and the drip of cold water from the ceiling. That was justice, 700,000 years ago. Strange, improvised, and terrifyingly effective. Justice didn't end with pits and caves. Once you were back among the tribe, there were rules. And if rules sound boring, keep in mind that prehistoric rules were enforced by people who had clubs and no patience. In a tribe where survival was measured in calories and fire embers, the rules weren't written down, but they were known as clearly as we know traffic laws today. The two biggest ones, unsurprisingly, were about food and fire. Food was sacred. Every bite represented hours of work, weeks of risk, and sometimes lives lost on the hunt. If you stole food, you weren't just sneaking an extra cookie. You were threatening the survival of the group. Steal too much, and someone else starves. So, the punishment for food theft was severe. At best, it was ridicule. Everyone would point, grunt, maybe toss a pebble at you to shame you back into line. At worst, it was exile. Imagine being shoved out into the icy wilderness with no fire, no weapons, and a half-empty stomach. That was the equivalent of a death sentence, except drawn out enough that the rest of the tribe didn't have to deal with the mess. Fire was the other sacred law. If food was life, fire was civilization itself. A tribe's fire had to be maintained constantly. If it went out in the middle of winter, relighting it wasn't as easy as striking a match. It could mean hours or days of effort, rubbing sticks, sparks refusing to catch, fingers growing numb in the cold. Fire negligence, the person assigned to tend the flames, but who nodded off instead, was a capital offense in its own quiet way. You could expect yelling, maybe a beating, and definitely a new permanent nickname like Ash Brain or Sleeps Too Much. These names stuck, by the way, because humor is one of humanity's most durable punishments. Beyond food and fire, there were other unspoken rules. Don't hoard tools. Don't refuse to share shelter. Don't wander off and bring predators back to camp like a furry parade. These were the guardrails of prehistoric society, and breaking them endangered everyone. Unlike modern laws, which often feel abstract, these rules were blunt and obvious. Your mistake could literally kill your neighbor. Disputes were resolved publicly, around the fire, with everyone watching. Imagine court, except no lawyers, no judge's gavel, just 30 people muttering, and the elder who coughed the least that day, declaring the verdict. Humor played a role here too. Sometimes, a guilty person would be forced to sit at the edge of the circle, wearing something humiliating, like a ridiculous headdress of animal bones, as if to say, "Look, this is the idiot who burned the mammoth steaks." Public shaming was both entertaining and effective, but for serious offenses, punishments escalated. A thief might have to give up their best spear, which in that world was like losing your car, your phone, and your fridge all at once. Someone who endangered the fire might be forced to sleep at the coldest edge of the shelter for weeks, far from the warm center, which was essentially prehistoric solitary confinement. And the truly unforgivable, the repeat offenders, the ones who couldn't or wouldn't follow the fragile balance of the tribe, were cast out. Exile is something we underestimate today. In the modern world, being cut off might mean losing Wi-Fi for a few hours. Back then, being exiled was a death sentence disguised as freedom. You could walk away with a handful of dried meat and maybe a sharp rock, but without the group, without the shared fire, and the dozens of eyes watching for predators, your chances of survival plummeted. Wolves don't care if you say you're innocent. Hunger doesn't care if you think you were misunderstood. Alone, you'd last days, at best. The rules of the tribe, then, weren't just about order. They were survival strategies. Everyone had to pull their weight. Everyone had to obey the rhythms that kept the group alive. And when someone broke the rules, the punishments were as much about teaching the lesson to the others as they were about justice. The tribe couldn't afford leniency, but they also couldn't afford endless brutality. Humor, shame, nicknames, light punishments, these were often the first resort, because laughter could knit the group back together after tension. But always behind the laughter was the silent truth. Break the wrong rule, and the cold outside will finish what the tribe starts. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine those tiny fireside courts, the laughter, the muttered complaints, the nervous glances toward the food pot. Imagine how fragile it all was, how a single stolen bite of meat or a forgotten ember could ripple out into catastrophe, and realize that in their rough way, those rules are still inside us. We still whisper against the greedy, still mock the careless, still exile, though now it's just muting someone in a group chat. The tools have changed, but the instincts remain. Daily life for a tribe 700,000 years ago was nothing like the neat routines we imagine when we think of daily life today. There were no to-do lists, no alarm clocks, no calendar apps politely reminding anyone to drink more water. The alarm clock was the sun, which had a bad habit of shining weakly through the freezing mist and disappearing far too soon behind the horizon. And the to-do list was simple but heavy. Survive, survive, and just to spice things up, survive some more. When the first light crept over the jagged horizon, the tribe stirred slowly, groaning and coughing from smoke-filled throats. Their shelters were crude, but essential. Mammoth bones stacked together and lashed with sinew, hides draped over the frame to keep out the worst of the wind. Inside, it was cramped, stuffy, and full of smells, animal grease, unwashed bodies, and the faint sweetness of drying berries that had been smuggled into storage. Babies cried, elders hacked, and someone inevitably complained about being elbowed in the ribs all night. Personal space was not an option. If you've ever had to share a twin bed with a sibling, multiply that discomfort by 20 and add a saber-toothed tiger growling outside in the dark. Food was always the first priority. The hunters prepared to track whatever unfortunate creature had the misfortune of wandering too close to their territory. Sometimes it was a rabbit, sometimes a deer, and sometimes, if the gods or dumb luck, smiled a woolly rhinoceros. But hunting wasn't guaranteed success. There were days when the hunters returned empty-handed, their shoulders slumped, their spears dragging in the snow, faces tight with shame. On those days, meals were a sad collection of roots dug from frozen ground, bitter plants, and the occasional bug crunched between teeth. The tribe pretended to enjoy it. Someone would mutter, "Ah yes, gourmet cuisine," while chewing on a grub, and laughter would ripple through the group, because humor is cheaper than meat, but almost as filling. Fire was the heart of the shelter. It flickered low in the middle of the smoky hut, and everyone gathered around it, like moths drawn to warmth. The fire was their stove, their heater, their entertainment system, and their therapist. Over it, meat was roasted, hides were dried, and awkward conversations happened. Imagine 30 people sitting shoulder to shoulder, trying to eat, while sparks popped into the air and the smell of cooking marrow drifted around. And of course, with everyone packed together, there was gossip. Who had stolen more than their fair share of dried meat? Who had tripped and fallen during the last hunt? Who had been flirting clumsily with the young woman from the next shelter over, only to be ignored? Laughter, teasing, and a fair amount of grunting commentary kept the fire circle alive, even when bellies were not full. The awkwardness of those firelit evenings cannot be overstated. There were no phones to scroll through when conversation lagged, no excuse to check email or leave the room. You had to sit there, in the flickering glow, staring at your cousin, across the circle, pretending you weren't still annoyed that he let the fire almost go out last week. Long silences filled the air, broken only by the occasional burp or the sound of someone gnawing a bone like they were auditioning for the world's worst orchestra. Still, in those silences, bonds were built. Humans learned to endure not just the cold, but each other. That, perhaps, was the real survival skill. Children played nearby, tumbling around with crude toys made from bones and stones, their laughter mixing with the crackle of fire. Elders leaned close together, muttering about the old days, which were probably just as terrible, but had become rosier in memory. The hunters sharpened their tools, the women checked the hides stretched for tanning, and everyone tried to ignore the hunger gnawing in their stomachs. Life was hard, yes, but it was also strangely ordinary. There were chores, responsibilities, inside jokes, and the timeless sound of people bickering over who got the last scrap of marrow. Even in this frozen, dangerous world, moments of levity were precious. Someone might mimic the call of a mammoth and make everyone laugh until smoke-filled lungs wheezed. Someone else might exaggerate the story of a hunt until the deer was described as taller than a tree and meaner than a lion. Around that fire, with bellies half empty, but spirits stitched together by humor, humanity survived another day. Fear of the unknown was not an occasional visitor to the tribe. It was their constant companion. Imagine waking every day into a world that felt both familiar and unpredictable. A world where one morning the sun shone weakly, and the next a blizzard roared so violently you thought the sky was tearing itself apart. They had no charts, no meteorologists, no neat explanations. When a storm hit, it wasn't cold front meeting warm front. It was the sky spirits are furious. And when the ground shook under their feet, it wasn't tectonic plates shifting. It was the earth monster rolling in its sleep. This uncertainty bred rituals. Humans hate not knowing, and prehistoric humans were no different. They built explanations out of scraps of observation and heavy doses of imagination. If the hunt failed 3 times in a row, maybe it was because they hadn't painted their faces with ash. If a child fell sick, perhaps the spirits were displeased, and a sacrifice was needed. It was guesswork wrapped in ceremony, but to them, it felt like control. And when control is rare, even illusion is comforting. Superstition shaped everything. Fires were arranged carefully, with logs placed in patterns that were thought to please unseen watchers. Meat was shared according to invisible hierarchies, not just practical need. Before a hunt, hunters rubbed ash into their hair or smeared blood across their chests, believing it made them invisible to prey. And when storms gathered, the entire tribe huddled close, muttering chants and staring into the fire as if flames could bargain with clouds. Some rituals were dark, like the sacrifices whispered about when food ran short. Others were oddly charming, dropping the first bite of a meal into the fire, for the spirits, was a common habit. Even if secretly, everyone thought the spirits were eating suspiciously well while their stomachs growled. And then there were the humorous failures. Someone once painted themselves entirely in mud to scare away evil winds, only to slip, fall, and cause such laughter that the storm outside seemed less frightening. Fear of the unknown was also a glue. It gave people a shared narrative, a reason to huddle together and agree that yes, the noise in the night was definitely a sky wolf, and not just the wind. Shared fear became shared ritual, and shared ritual became identity. Without it, the tribe might have fractured, each person blaming the other for bad luck. With it, they at least had the comfort of thinking they were doing something, even if that something was smearing deer blood across their cheeks. And of course, there was always humor tucked between the terror. Someone would inevitably grumble that the spirits were just picky eaters, or that the sky wolf was probably just hungry for Jerry's bad stew. Laughter chased away some of the fear, but it never erased it completely. The unknown was too vast, too relentless. Still, superstition gave fear a shape. It turned chaos into something you could at least talk to, even if that something was invisible and had a taste for burnt offerings. So, as you drift into sleep, imagine those trembling faces lit by firelight, their eyes wide at the rumble of distant thunder, their voices raised in strange chants meant to soothe the sky. Imagine the rituals that rose from fear, the half-comical, half-tragic attempts to tame a world far beyond their understanding. They lived not knowing, but they lived. And in their rituals born of superstition, sharpened by desperation, you can hear the first heartbeat of the long story of human belief, pulsing even now. Rituals didn't begin with torches, face paint, and loud chants. They began quietly, almost accidentally, as little gestures of hope in a world that rarely gave any. Imagine being in that tiny tribe, where every day was a gamble against the cold, hunger, and predators that could flatten you faster than you could yell, "Help." People needed something more than sharpened sticks and furry coats of mammoth hide. They needed meaning. And when you don't understand why the sun vanishes behind clouds for weeks at a time, or why the herd of deer you depend on suddenly disappears, you invent reasons. Reasons turn into stories, and stories turn into rituals. It probably started small. A hunter might have dropped a piece of meat into the fire, just a scrap, muttering that it was for the spirits. Everyone laughed at him. Spirits? Really? But when the next hunt was successful, the tribe remembered the gesture. Soon, every meal had its first bite tossed into the flames, just in case unseen beings were watching. What had been one man's nervous habit became a custom, and custom hardened into ritual. Humans, after all, are creatures who love patterns. When life is chaotic, we cling to anything that feels like a cause and effect chain. Then came bigger gestures. When storms flattened shelters, when disease swept through, when food stores dwindled, someone somewhere said, "We must have done something wrong." And if wrong could be done, then it could also be undone. How? By sacrifice. Give something up, something valuable, and maybe, just maybe, the universe would give mercy in return. A necklace of bones, the finest spear, even the fattest cut of meat. These were burned, broken, or buried as offerings. It wasn't rational, not in the scientific sense, but it made psychological sense. By giving away what hurt to lose, they felt they had bargained with fate. The rituals grew more elaborate with time. Paint smeared across faces, chants echoing into the night, fire arranged in strange patterns. None of it actually changed the weather, of course, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling of control. Imagine being surrounded by forces you can't understand. Lightning arcs across the sky. Terrifying. Unpredictable. Without science to tell you about electricity, you tell yourself, it's the gods striking matches in anger. If you just smear enough blood on a stone, maybe they'll calm down. And humor slips in here too. Because let's be honest, half these rituals must have looked ridiculous. Picture one elder shouting at the storm while another trips over a log mid-chant. Or imagine a family trying to keep a straight face while someone insists the spirits prefer their offerings extra smoky, like the world's pickiest barbecue judge. Even back then, people must have rolled their eyes while still participating, because better to look foolish together than to risk angering the sky by being the only skeptic. But sometimes, rituals escalated. When food was plentiful, symbolic offerings were enough. But when desperation clawed at empty stomachs, people believed the spirits demanded more. If a scrap of meat got you one deer, surely a larger sacrifice would bring the mammoth herds back. Logic twisted under hunger's pressure. Bigger loss equaled bigger favor. A life for life. And so ritual began to involve not just objects, but living beings. At first, it might have been animals. A dog-like creature, maybe a goat-like ancestor. Animals were easier to part with, and their blood felt powerful, dramatic, a message that surely the gods couldn't miss. The tribe would gather, the sacrifice made, and when good fortune followed, even by coincidence, the ritual was declared successful. The pattern was reinforced. The line between cause and coincidence blurred, and so humans, hungry and frightened, leaned harder into ritual sacrifice. And from there, the steps toward darker choices became smaller than we might imagine. Because when the stakes are survival, when you believe spirits are as real as the snow on your face, no offering ever feels too extreme. The rituals had begun as gestures of gratitude and bargaining, but under pressure, they became desperate negotiations. Humans will do nearly anything to avoid staring directly into the abyss of powerlessness. And so the fires grew hotter, the chants grew louder, and the offerings became bloodier. And as you breathe slowly now, sinking deeper into warmth and comfort, remember that, for them, ritual wasn't optional. It wasn't a quirky cultural thing. It was survival itself, wrapped in symbolism, stained with blood and hope. It was their way of saying, we're not helpless. We still have something to give. And though the rituals may seem strange, even horrifying to us, the truth is, we still carry that instinct today. We cross our fingers, we knock on wood, we whisper prayers into the silence, not so different from tossing scraps into fire, hoping unseen forces listen. The choice of babies as sacrifices is one of the most unsettling truths about the darker side of early human ritual. It's hard to even whisper it without wincing. But to understand why such a practice emerged, you have to see the world through their eyes, not ours. Babies represented purity. They were untouched by failure, sin, or the petty mistakes of adults. In the minds of the tribe, if the spirits were angry, then only the most perfect, unspoiled offering could soothe them. And what could be more perfect than a child? This wasn't cruelty in the way we might frame it now. It wasn't about sadism or hatred. It was about desperation and symbolism. A baby was not seen as just another member of the group. It was a vessel of purity, the cleanest bargaining chip with forces too big to comprehend. If giving up an animal pleased the gods a little, giving up a baby was thought to be the ultimate plea. The grand gesture that proved the tribe was serious. There was also the harsh arithmetic of survival. In a group of 30 people, everyone had to contribute. Hunters risked their lives to bring food, gatherers scoured landscapes for roots and berries. Elders shared hard-won knowledge. Babies, though beloved, consumed resources without contributing. They cried at the worst times, drawing predators closer. They needed food, warmth, and attention, but could not help gather or fight. In the calculus of starvation, this made them tragically expendable. It is chilling, yes, but in a desperate tribe clinging to life, such logic carried weight. Imagine a winter where every day brought emptiness, where mothers' breasts gave no milk, where even the hunters grew gaunt. In those moments, the elders might say, the gods demand the most precious gift. Parents, grieving, but pressured, gave in. And when the ritual was done, when smoke rose into the starry sky, carrying the child's spirit upward, the tribe believed they had secured favor. Even if coincidence brought a break in the weather or the sudden appearance of prey, the ritual was reinforced. The practice survived because, sometimes, luck followed horror. And yet, even in this grim context, there must have been resistance. Mothers clutching children tighter, fathers snarling in defiance, whispers of, why not the old ones instead? But tradition and fear are powerful. When your neighbors and kin all insist that the gods demand babies, standing against it feels like courting disaster for everyone. The tribe's unity depended on shared ritual, and dissent was dangerous. There's a haunting irony here. The very act meant to secure survival sacrificing babies was also what endangered the tribe's future. Less children meant fewer hunters in the next generation, fewer hands to gather food, fewer minds to carry on knowledge. But long-term logic was a luxury in a world where you might not survive the week. The choice of babies wasn't rational in our terms, but it was, in their worldview, the clearest way to trade today's pain for tomorrow's hope. If all this sounds unbearably grim, remember that humor existed, even here, around the edges of darkness. People joked about which child was loudest, as if noise might make them more appealing to the spirits. Someone muttered that the gods had picky taste, preferring babies fattened on milk rather than scrawny winterborns. These jokes weren't cruel. They were survival mechanisms, the only way to breathe in the heavy smoke of tragedy. So, as you drift now, safe and warm, let the strangeness of it sink in. To them, babies were the bridge between human desperation and divine mercy. To us, it's unthinkable. But in their world of endless cold, hunger, and fear, the shocking choice seemed not only possible, but necessary. And while the flames that consumed those offerings have long since died, the echoes remain in our shared memory, reminders of just how far humans will go when the unknown presses too close. Cooking methods in the prehistoric world were not guided by celebrity chefs, glossy cookbooks, or arguments on the internet about whether pineapple belongs on pizza. They were guided by desperation, opportunity, and whatever someone figured out wouldn't immediately kill the entire group with food poisoning. To imagine their cuisine, you have to strip away the comforting smells of roasted chicken, the buttery sizzle of a skillet, the friendly beep of a microwave, and replace it with smoky fires, sizzling fat dripping into the flames, and the occasional horrified expression when something turned out less edible than planned. The central tool of prehistoric cooking was fire, and even that was unpredictable. A fire could be your best friend, turning raw meat into savory survival fuel, or it could be your worst enemy, sputtering out in the middle of winter, or flaring up and burning the precious hide you were drying nearby. The first cooks weren't picky. They didn't season with salt, pepper, or fancy herbs. They seasoned with ash, because ash had a way of ending up in everything, whether you wanted it to or not. If you've ever been to a barbecue where the burgers taste vaguely like charcoal, congratulations, you've already had a prehistoric dining experience. Roasting was the most common technique. Hunters would bring back whatever unlucky creature they managed to spear, and someone would skin it with stone flakes, hack it into manageable pieces, and throw it directly onto the flames. Not near the flames, not delicately suspended above them, with clever racks, directly on top, sizzling, popping, blackening. You might think this ruined the meat, but after a few weeks of gnawing on half-frozen roots, anything that smelled, even vaguely roasted, was a 5-star meal. Burnt edges were chewed off, without complaint, and the inner flesh, smoky and faintly sweet, was considered a delicacy. Boiling, in its early form, was another technique, though less common. You can't boil without a container, and since pottery wasn't around yet, early tribes improvised. They dug pits in the ground, lined them with animal hide or clay, filled them with water, and dropped in hot stones, pulled from the fire until the water hissed and steamed. Meat and plants were tossed in, stirred with sticks, and simmered until soft enough to chew. This was less soup and more mystery sludge, but it stretched ingredients and made them easier to digest. Picture a watery stew filled with mammoth sinew, bitter roots, and the occasional bug that wandered in, accidentally. Bon appetit. Then there was smoking, a happy accident discovered when someone left meat too close to the fire overnight and realized the smoke preserved it. What began as negligence became a survival tactic. Strips of meat were hung over smoldering embers, slowly drying in the rising smoke until they turned tough, chewy, and long-lasting. Think prehistoric jerky. The taste? Imagine beef jerky, but chewier, smokier, and with just enough grit in your teeth to remind you that this was not made in a factory, but beside a dirt floor and a smoky fire. Cooking wasn't just about flavor, it was about safety. Raw meat carried parasites. Undercooked roots were toxic. Even water could be dangerous if left untreated. Fire became a kind of invisible doctor, killing unseen threats. People didn't know about bacteria, of course. They just knew that cooked food didn't make them vomit as much. That was enough. And when someone inevitably ate the wrong thing, a mushroom that looked tasty but proved fatal, or a plant that made everyone violently ill, the lesson was learned, grimly and permanently. Prehistoric cuisine was an endless experiment, the kind where failures had serious consequences. Humor existed here, too, because humans can't help themselves. Imagine a hunter proudly dropping a strange animal onto the fire, while the others groaned, remembering last time when strange animal turned into 3 days of stomach cramps. Or picture someone attempting to impress their group by stirring a stone-boiled stew and ending up with half the meal stuck to the rock they used as a spoon. Even then, jokes softened the edges of hunger. Someone would mutter, "At least the spirits like it crispy," while gnawing on meat charred beyond recognition. So yes, prehistoric cooking methods were crude, but they worked. Roasting, boiling, smoking, sometimes even burying food under hot ashes to cook slowly. These were the techniques that allowed people to survive in impossible conditions. It was cuisine born of necessity, not preference. And as you drift into the warmth of your own comfortable bed, think of those smoky firesides, where survival itself was flavored with burnt fat and ash. And dinner was less about taste and more about waking up alive tomorrow. The beliefs behind these rituals and meals were not scientific theories or carefully written doctrines. They were living, breathing fears and hopes, wrapped in story and passed down in whispers and chants. The tribe looked at the world around them: storms, droughts, sudden deaths, lucky hunts, and tried to make sense of it all. Without meteorology, geology, or biology, what was left? Spirits, sky gods, invisible forces with moods as unpredictable as the weather. To the tribe, the world was alive in every direction. The sky was a being, the earth had moods, the river whispered secrets, and the fire itself had an appetite. Nothing was inert, nothing was random. If lightning struck, it wasn't electrical discharge. It was the sky god flashing anger. If prey animals vanished, it wasn't migration. It was punishment from unseen watchers. The universe was a giant, temperamental neighbor, and the tribe believed they had to keep it pleased. Magical thinking grew naturally in this environment. Humans are storytellers, and when faced with mystery, we invent explanations. A child falls sick. Perhaps a spirit crawled into their body. The hunt fails. Maybe someone angered the sky god by speaking out of turn. Fire goes out unexpectedly. Surely the flames are sulking because no one fed them properly. Every misfortune had a reason, and every reason had a remedy. Ritual. Rituals became the language of negotiation. Offer the spirits something valuable, and maybe they would return the favor. A scrap of meat for better hunting, ash smeared across your face for protection, chants shouted into the wind to chase away storms. Sometimes these gestures worked by sheer coincidence, which only strengthened the belief. If a storm passed after a chant, then surely the chant had power. If the hunt succeeded after a sacrifice, then clearly the gods had been appeased. Cause and effect blurred, and magical thinking hardened into tradition. There was hierarchy to these spirits. Sky gods loomed the largest, because the sky dictated so much rain, sun, storms, snow. The earth spirits were equally important, because crops, roots, and animals came from the ground. Fire was its own strange being, a hungry mouth that devoured wood and flesh alike. People respected it, with the same fear they reserved for predators. To feed fire was to feed a god. Even ordinary objects could be touched by magic. A stone shaped strangely might be considered sacred. A tree that survived lightning could become an altar. Everyday life was threaded with signs, omens, and unseen rules. The beliefs weren't just for big rituals. They infused everything: how people stepped into rivers, how they arranged their sleeping spaces, how they spoke around firelight. Humor crept in even here. People teased one another about being cursed, or about having particularly picky guardian spirits. Someone might grumble that the gods clearly hated their cooking, which explained why their rabbit stew always came out terrible. These jokes weren't rebellion. They were relief valves, ways to laugh at the weight of the unknown. Still, the seriousness remained. The tribe lived in a world where bad luck was never just bad luck. It was a message, a warning, a punishment. And so their lives revolved around endless small negotiations with forces they couldn't see but believed in absolutely. So, as you drift deeper into comfort now, picture that world of magical thinking. Imagine the fire glowing like a hungry god, the storm rolling in like an angry spirit, the river murmuring secrets. To them, the world wasn't empty. It was crowded with invisible personalities, all demanding attention. And every ritual, every offering, every whispered chant was a way of surviving not just the cold and hunger, but the crushing uncertainty of existence itself. The role of storytelling in prehistoric tribes cannot be overstated. Without books, without scrolls, without even cave walls at times, stories were the glue that held people together, the invisible net that gave rituals weight. When the wind howled outside the shelter and the fire flickered uncertainly, stories explained why. They turned confusion into narrative, randomness into cause, and fear into something you could point at. And most importantly, they justified the rituals that defined survival. Picture a group of people gathered around the fire after a long, bitter day. Smoke curls upward, filling the small space with a haze that makes every set of eyes look dreamy and distant. Everyone's stomach growls, but no one has the energy to complain. This is when a storyteller clears their throat, a sound that immediately commands attention, because, frankly, what else are you going to do in a world without TikTok? The firelight dances across their face, giving their features an eerie glow, as they begin with words that promise a reason behind the chaos. Long ago, when the sky was still young, the stories explained everything, from why the sun rose in the morning to why sacrifices were necessary. If you didn't perform the ritual, the spirits would grow restless. If you neglected the offering, the gods would hide the animals. Myths wrapped brutal decisions in the soft blanket of meaning. When a baby was chosen as a sacrifice, it wasn't because the tribe was cruel. It was because the story said the sky god demanded pure life to open the clouds. When meat was dropped into the flames, it wasn't waste. It was feeding the fire spirit, who would otherwise sulk and abandon the tribe in the cold. The story was the contract, the ritual, the signature. And because stories were spoken, not written, they shifted like smoke, bending to fit the needs of the moment. If a ritual seemed too harsh, the tale might grow an extra branch. Perhaps the gods would accept a lamb instead, or maybe a symbolic offering could suffice for now. Storytellers were lawyers, politicians, and priests rolled into one. They shaped myth to keep peace, to justify decisions, to keep everyone convinced that their suffering had purpose. Humor seeped in too, because no audience, even one half starving, will sit still for hours of pure doom. A storyteller might exaggerate, turning the storm spirits into grumpy old men, arguing over whose turn it was to throw lightning. Or they might mimic the hunting gods, pretending they had terrible aim, sending deer scattering in every direction. People laughed, relief blooming in the firelight. The story still justified the ritual, but laughter softened its edges. These myths traveled across generations. A child sitting at the edge of the fire, wide-eyed, would grow into an adult who told the same story, slightly altered, to their own children. Myths gained weight with age, becoming truth simply because they were repeated. And so, rituals endured, long after anyone remembered their exact origin. Why do we burn the first bite of meat? Someone might ask. And the answer would come, because the story says so. That was enough. In a world without science, stories were the science. In a world without law, stories were the law. They explained why sacrifices began, why they must continue, and why disobedience invited disaster. They were more than entertainment. They were survival guides, disguised as tales. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine those stories weaving through smoke and darkness, wrapping ritual in meaning so tightly that no one dared unravel it. Community dynamics in prehistoric tribes were complicated in the simplest possible way. There were no formal councils, no ballot boxes, no gavels. Decisions were made by those who spoke the loudest, carried the biggest spears, or coughed the least during the firelight debates. Leadership wasn't about election, it was about survival credibility. If you'd led 3 successful hunts in a row, you had a louder voice. If you were old enough to remember a time when the river dried and came back again, people listened. And if you were the kind of person who could tell a story that made people laugh while explaining why you had to sacrifice the family goat, well, then you had real influence. But decision-making wasn't as simple as one chief barking orders. Tribes were small, 20 to 50 people, and everyone's survival was intertwined. A bad choice could kill the group, so discussions often stretched late into the night. Picture it. Elders hunched together, muttering, hunters sharpening their spears with exaggerated sighs, mothers glaring at anyone who even hinted their children might be part of the next ritual. It was politics, but politics conducted in mammoth skin cloaks instead of suits. Who objected? Almost everyone. At some point, people objected to sacrifices, to hunting routes, to how food was divided. Objection wasn't about ideology, it was about hunger and fear. A mother might cry out against losing her baby to ritual. A young hunter might argue that the spirits wouldn't mind skipping the sacrifice if they just worked harder on the hunt. But objecting carried risk. Too much dissent looked like rebellion. and rebellion was dangerous in groups so small. Too much noise. And suddenly, you found yourself sleeping at the cold edge of the shelter. Or worse, being nudged toward exile. Humor was a way to object without fully objecting. Someone might mutter, "If the spirits really wanted meat, they should come hunt with us next time." Laughter rippled, tension eased, but the point was made. The community relied on these sideways comments to question, without outright challenging authority. Think of it as the prehistoric version of sarcasm in a meeting. Everyone knows what's being implied, but no one has to admit it directly. Still, hierarchy was clear. Elders carried weight, not just because of their years, but because of the knowledge locked inside them, where to find roots in drought, how to recognize the sky before a storm. Hunters carried weight because they risked their lives. Women carried weight because they managed food, fire, and the fragile continuation of life itself. Children, of course, had no say, except for the occasional dramatic wailing that interrupted counsel. Decisions were messy compromises. Who to sacrifice, how to divide meat, when to move camp. These choices were argued, shouted, cried over, but in the end, survival required unity. Once the decision was made, everyone had to follow. A fractured tribe was a dead tribe. Objections might simmer, but unity was enforced with peer pressure, ritual, and sometimes the subtle threat of exile. And yet, humanity showed itself even here. Parents clung to their children. Lovers defended each other. Friends whispered support in the shadows. The tribe wasn't just a machine grinding out survival, it was a web of relationships, messy and emotional. And around the fire, in the smoky glow, you could see those relationships collide in every decision. So, as you sink deeper into sleep, imagine those gatherings, the murmurs, the laughter, the angry glares, the heavy silences. Community dynamics weren't neat or tidy, but they were the lifeline of survival. And in those tense, awkward councils, the story of humanity, our endless debate between authority and dissent, was already unfolding. The first dissenters in any society are rarely loud, fist-pounding rebels. They don't leap onto rocks and deliver thunderous speeches about freedom while everyone cheers. More often, they whisper. They whisper at the edge of the fire when the crackle of flames covers their voices. They whisper while carrying water back from the river, glancing over their shoulders to make sure no elder is close enough to hear. And in the earliest tribes, when rituals became increasingly bloody and sacrifices escalated to the unthinkable, these whispers began, "Maybe, let's not do this." Oh, it's not hard to imagine how dangerous such a thought was. Rituals weren't just customs, they were survival strategies, woven into myth, reinforced by story. To question them wasn't just to question tradition. It was to risk being blamed if something went wrong. If you refused a sacrifice and then a storm rolled in the next day, guess whose fault it suddenly became? Exactly. The loudest critic became the scapegoat. And so, dissent had to be cautious, whispered, hidden. Picture a mother who has lost one child to ritual and clutches another in her arms. She doesn't stand in front of the tribe and demand change. She leans toward another mother and murmurs, "What if the spirits don't really want this? What if they want something else? Stones? Maybe? Or songs?" The other mother nods, eyes darting nervously, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, but both feeling the weight of a thought too dangerous to speak aloud. Or, imagine a young hunter, skeptical because he has seen patterns the others ignore. He notices that prey animals return, regardless of whether the tribe makes sacrifices. He notices that storms sometimes pass without rituals. Around the fire, when everyone is exhausted, he jokes, "Maybe the gods just like to watch us panic." The others laugh nervously, half shocked, half relieved, because humor is the only safe mask for doubt. He shrugs, as if it's nothing, but the seed has been planted. These dissenters weren't trying to overthrow anything. They were trying to protect, to preserve, to ask whether the cost of ritual was worth it. They were the ones who wondered if maybe the spirits weren't so picky, if maybe there was another way. Sometimes their questions were born of grief, sometimes of logic, sometimes just sheer exhaustion. But each whisper was dangerous, because in a small group, whispers spread like smoke. And of course, some dissenters paid the price. A woman who resisted might be branded cursed, her protests silenced with threats or exile. A hunter who scoffed too loudly might be volunteered for extra dangerous hunts. And yet, dissent never disappeared. It couldn't. The human mind, stubborn and curious, always pokes at the rules, always wonders, always pushes against the edges. There is even humor in the idea of these dissenters. Imagine one poor soul muttering, "I don't think the gods want us to cook Kevin, only for Kevin's mother, to give him the dirtiest glare imaginable." Or a hunter rolling his eyes and saying, "If the spirits are so hungry, why don't they go hunt a mammoth themselves?" The tribe would laugh, half in relief, half in fear, because they all thought the same thing, but dared not say it outright. The first dissenters didn't change everything overnight, but their whispers marked the beginning of something deeply human. Skepticism, the ability to say, even quietly, "What if we're wrong?" What? That doubt didn't stop rituals entirely, but over generations, it softened them, reshaped them, made them less bloody and more symbolic. A whispered, "Maybe not," became a cautious compromise, and compromise slowly rewrote tradition. And as you drift into sleep, remember those quiet voices. They were not heroes in shining armor. They were tired, grieving, sometimes sarcastic, sometimes afraid. But their whispers carried forward through time, echoing into every moment when humanity has questioned its own traditions. It all began with someone at the edge of a smoky fire, eyes on the stars, saying softly, "Maybe, let's not do this." If dissenters whispered, "Maybe not," neighboring tribes often responded with a confident, "Oh, we do something even weirder." Rituals were never identical. Each group invented its own strange ways of bargaining with the unknown. And if you could hop between tribes 700,000 years ago, it would feel like visiting a bizarre theme park of human superstition. Some tribes believed the spirits didn't want blood, but sound. They staged noisy rituals where everyone banged sticks on hollow logs, shouted into the sky, and clapped until their hands stung. To outsiders, it must have looked like a prehistoric rock concert, complete with the same offbeat rhythm section that plagues family drummers to this day. These rituals were meant to scare away evil winds or chase predators back into the shadows. And when they worked by coincidence, say, a storm passed, after the noise, people swore it was proof. Others leaned towards smoke. Instead of sacrifices, they burned great piles of herbs, grasses, and dung, filling the air with clouds so thick they made eyes water. The belief was that the smoke carried prayers upward, that the gods preferred their messages pre-smoked, like a piece of jerky. Imagine choking through one of those ceremonies, trying to keep a solemn face while half the tribe is coughing and sneezing. Yet, they believed it was the proper way to reach the sky. There were even tribes who turned rituals into athletic spectacles. Before a hunt, men would race across fields, leaping over logs, or wrestling one another, the winner believed to be chosen by the spirits. for luck. It was half ritual, half entertainment, and entirely an excuse for young hunters to show off. Picture a bunch of prehistoric men puffing out their chests, tackling each other, and insisting it was for the gods, while the elders shook their heads knowingly. And then there were rituals that, to modern ears, sound downright bizarre. Some groups buried animal bones under their shelters, believing this tethered protective spirits to their homes. Others cut designs into the earth with sticks, elaborate spirals and circles, convinced the patterns would attract good fortune. To an outsider, it might have looked like children playing in the dirt, but for the tribe, it was sacred geometry. Comparing these rituals side by side shows just how inventive humans are when faced with the unknown. One group offers blood, another offers noise, another offers smoke, another runs in circles until someone falls on their face. Each believed their method was the one true path, each confident that without it, disaster would strike. And if one tribe's crops failed, or the hunt went badly, neighboring groups would nod smugly and say, "Well, you must not have done it properly." Humor flourished even here. People mocked neighboring rituals in private, imitating the ridiculous dances or exaggerated coughs. Around the fire, someone might mimic the tribe next valley over, pretending to wave smoke dramatically while collapsing in a fake coughing fit. Everyone laughed, but underneath the humor was nervous respect. Because what if those neighbors were right? What if their smoke really did reach the sky gods more effectively? And so rituals spread, shifted, combined. A tribe might borrow a neighbor's noisy drumming, then blend it with their own sacrifices. Another might adopt the racing competitions, but insist on painting themselves with ash first. Rituals were contagious, like memes, bouncing from one group to another, mutating along the way. What began as sacrifice to the fire god could, 3 valleys over, become scream loudly at the sky while holding a chicken. As strange as they seem, these rituals reveal a deep truth. Humans everywhere needed structure, needed action, needed to feel like they weren't helpless in the face of storms and hunger. Whether through smoke, noise, races, or sacrifices, every tribe crafted its own bizarre toolkit for negotiating with the unknown. And though they laughed at each other, they also learned from one another, slowly building the cultural patchwork that still defines humanity. So, as you close your eyes tonight, imagine drifting between tribes, watching each one perform its unique rituals, the smoke-filled dances, the noisy chants, the awkward races, some funny, some terrifying, all deeply human. It's a reminder that no matter how different the customs, they all sprang from the same place: fear, hope, and the endless need to make sense of a world that refused to explain itself. Accidental discoveries were the hidden gifts buried inside the heavy rituals of early humanity. It's strange to think that in between the smoke, the chanting, and the grim sacrifices, people stumbled across some of the first big innovations that would eventually carry us forward. Ritual wasn't just about begging spirits for mercy, it was also a kind of laboratory, even if no one called it that. When you gather everyone around a fire, when you experiment with bones, hides, and flames, sometimes you get more than smoke in your eyes. Sometimes you discover how to cook better, how to tame fire, or how to shape tools that could split the difference between life and death. Take cooking, for example. Imagine a ritual where meat is tossed into the flames as an offering. At first, people probably winced at the waste. Food was life. But after the ritual, when the smoke cleared and the meat was half charred, Someone must have sniffed the air and thought, that actually smells good? Ack, ack, good? A brave soul pulled a piece out of the ashes, blew off the dirt, and bit in. It was smoky, warm, easier to chew. And just like that, the tribe realized that fire didn't just destroy food, it transformed it. A ritual offering became an accidental recipe. The spirits might have gotten the first bite, but the humans discovered barbecue. Fire itself was shaped by ritual. The need to keep a flame alive for ceremonies forced tribes to experiment with keeping embers smoldering for longer. They piled ash over glowing coals, discovering it slowed the burn and kept heat alive for hours. They stacked logs in careful patterns to make flames last through the night. What began as appeasing fire spirits ended up as practical fire management. People learned how to move embers from one site to another, tucked inside bundles of bark or dung, keeping sacred flames alive during migration. To the tribe, it was divine. To history, it was engineering. Tools, too, were caught in this cycle of ritual and discovery. During sacrifices, bones were sometimes cracked open for marrow offerings. In the process, someone noticed that a sharp flake of bone could cut through hide more cleanly than a dull stone. Soon, bones weren't just ritual items but knives. Stones smashed in ritual fires, shattered in interesting ways, producing sharp-edged flakes. Someone connected the dots and realized you could create those shards deliberately, giving birth to early flint knapping. It's as if the spirits, in demanding their sacrifices, unintentionally handed humans the blueprints for survival. Even clothing was touched by accident. Ritual dances often involved painting bodies with ash or draping hides in dramatic ways. Those hides kept people warmer, even when worn just for show. Gradually, ritual decoration merged with practical fashion. What began as a costume to please the gods became a coat that saved your life when the wind howled. Imagine the moment someone realized that rubbing fat into hides made them more water-resistant, probably discovered because fat was smeared in rituals. The gods may have gotten the credit, but trial and error did the heavy lifting. Humor shines through here as well. You can picture someone scolding another, "Stop eating the offerings. Those are for the gods," while secretly nibbling at the edges themselves. Or the first time someone tried to sharpen a stone in a ceremonial fire and ended up with shards flying dangerously across the shelter. Mistakes were made, but each mistake carved the path forward. So, while rituals may seem wasteful or cruel from a distance, they were also incubators of innovation. By forcing people to gather, to experiment with fire, food, bones, and hides, rituals created accidents that weren't really accidents at all. They were discoveries waiting to happen. And though the tribe thought they were feeding gods, what they were really feeding was their own survival toolkit, one awkward ritual at a time. The climate monster was the great enemy lurking behind all of this. Ice ages weren't polite, little cold spells. They were cataclysms that reshaped continents, dropped sea levels, and forced humans into a game of survival that felt unwinnable. Imagine a world where winter never ends, where the horizon is dominated by walls of ice, where rivers vanish under frozen slabs, and where the very air seems determined to rob the breath from your lungs. This was not the cozy snow globe fantasy we picture at Christmas. It was more like living inside a freezer that occasionally shook itself into a blizzard. The desperation born from these climates is hard for us to grasp. Food vanished for months at a time. Herd animals migrated far beyond reach. Plants withered, their roots locked in ice. Water froze solid, forcing people to melt snow just to drink. And the cold was relentless. It wasn't the kind of cold you could escape with layers. It seeped through furs, bit at toes, turned fingers stiff, until tools slipped uselessly from your grasp. Fire helped, but even fire seemed fragile, flickering against winds that howled like wild beasts. It was in this setting that rituals became more desperate, more extreme. When you've been snowed in for weeks and your food stores are gone, you begin to see patterns in the storm. You tell yourself the gods are angry. You tell yourself the ice is punishment. And so, sacrifices escalate, chants grow louder, fires are stoked higher. Anything to fight back against the monster, in the sky and ground. The climate wasn't just weather, it was a living enemy, unpredictable and cruel. Ice ages forced migrations. Tribes moved south, searching for warmer valleys, but even there, the cold followed. Rivers dried in summer, froze in winter, making water an unpredictable gift. The desperation was constant. Every day brought the question, what will kill us? First hunger, cold, or the predators stalking the edge of camp. It's no wonder myths painted the world as alive with spirits, because the environment itself behaved like a predator. And yet, even in this desperation, humor found a way. Imagine someone grumbling, maybe the gods just hate us personally, while scraping ice off their face. Or another insisting the spirits must be tired of sacrifices and just want the tribe to freeze quietly. Laughter, even bitter laughter, was a shield against the crushing cold. The Ice Ages didn't just shape rituals, they shaped humanity itself. They forced cooperation, invention, and endurance. They pushed people to the brink and demanded they claw their way back. The climate monster was merciless, but in fighting it, humans became tougher, smarter, more adaptable. And when you lie warm now, in a bed, the ancients couldn't imagine, you carry their victory over that frozen terror. You are proof that, somehow, people faced the ice and lived to tell stories about it. Imagine, for a moment, that cavemen had Yelp. Not in the sense of smartphones and Wi-Fi, you'd be lucky if you could get a spark out of a couple of flints, but in the sense of grumbling, reviewing, and rating each other's rituals with the same passive-aggressive tone modern people use for coffee shops. It's not hard to picture. Humanity has always had a knack for complaining, and you know somewhere, huddled around a fire, a prehistoric man was muttering, 2 stars, would not sacrifice again. You can almost hear the reviews. Ritual last night took 3 hours. Chanting was off-key. Smoke got in my eyes. And the gods still didn't send the deer herd. Very disappointed. 1 star. Another tribe member might have left a more positive review. Great ambiance. Loved the firelight. Really enjoyed the ash face paint. Sacrifice portion was a bit overcooked, but overall, a solid ceremony. 4 stars. Would recommend to spirits. The fun of imagining this is that it reveals how rituals, like any group activity, probably had their critics. Some people were true believers, convinced that without every drumbeat and smear of blood the world would end. Others were skeptics, but polite enough to play along. And some were surely eye-rollers, whispering sarcastic reviews in the back, while the ritual unfolded. Gods must be laughing at us again. Last time we danced naked in the snow, and the only thing that showed up was frostbite. 0 stars. Picture 2 elders arguing like rival chefs. One insists that the spirits prefer offerings burned to a crisp. The other swears the gods want them rare, barely warmed. The compromise? A half-charred, half-raw mess everyone pretends to enjoy. Later, someone mumbles, "Next time, let's try medium rare. Spirits deserve quality, too." That's essentially a caveman Yelp review in action Constant critique, disguised as tradition. There's even room for comedy in imagining prehistoric influences. Some charismatic hunter, convinced he knows exactly how to please the gods, boasts, "Follow my ritual plan, guaranteed mammoth in 3 days, or your offerings back." He gathers a little following. People swear his method works. And suddenly, you have the earliest version of a 5-star reviewed ritual leader. Meanwhile, another hunter sulks because his sacrifices never seem to work out, and the tribe leaves him poor reviews in whispered jokes. Would not hunt with this guy again. Spirits clearly hate him. These imagined reviews soften the heavy weight of rituals. They remind us that people then were just as human as we are now. They complained, they laughed, they teased each other, even as they offered precious food or life itself to unseen forces. Someone was muttering sarcastically about the smoke being too thick, or the drumming too loud, or the gods being picky eaters. Humor was the relief valve that kept the rituals from crushing everyone under their seriousness. It was the Yelp review, muttered in the corner, that allowed people to endure another long night of chanting without losing their minds. So, while there was no prehistoric internet, there was definitely prehistoric commentary, not written with stars and emojis, but with eye rolls, groans, and laughter around the fire. And if the gods were listening, maybe they appreciated the reviews too. After all, even sky spirits might prefer a ceremony with better pacing and fewer off-key chants. The gradual shift away from baby cooking rituals didn't happen with a sudden proclamation or a dramatic rebellion. It happened slowly, unevenly, over generations, as hunger eased in some seasons, as alternatives appeared, and as whispers of doubt grew louder. Human traditions rarely change in a single moment. They erode like stone under water, bit by bit, until what was once unthinkable becomes unnecessary, and then finally becomes unremembered. At first, sacrifices of children were seen as the most powerful offering, the ultimate proof of devotion. But every time it happened, grief tore through families. Parents mourned, siblings cried, and the tribe carried a wound that never truly healed. Even those who believed in the ritual felt the sting. It's one thing to burn meat or smash a pot for the spirits. It's another to silence the cries of a child. Over time, the emotional weight pressed heavily against the practice. People began to wonder if there wasn't another way. Alternatives crept in. Maybe the spirits would accept animals instead. A goat, a deer, or even a bird was easier to part with and less devastating to the tribe's future. When a hunt was successful, an animal could be chosen as the symbolic child, its blood spilled in the fire with the same solemn chants. And when the storm passed, or the prey returned, the tribe sighed in relief. Perhaps the gods were satisfied. The substitution became habit. Symbolism grew as well. Instead of sacrificing actual life, people began offering tokens. A carved figurine, a doll made of straw or bone, placed into the flames with the same reverence. To the spirits, the gesture was enough, or so people convinced themselves. And every time the tribe survived another winter, without losing a child, the belief that substitutes worked gained strength. The gods weren't picky after all. Or maybe the dissenters were right. Maybe the rituals were never about the sacrifice, but about the unity of performing them. The shift was gradual, but it was also cultural. Neighboring tribes, with different rituals, influenced each other. If one group survived using animal offerings, others took note. If another replaced blood with songs and still found game to hunt, the idea spread. Stories changed too. Myths were flexible, always adjusting to the needs of the time. Elders began telling tales, where the gods accepted lambs, or where a hero tricked the spirits with a symbolic sacrifice. and still saved his people. Over generations, the stories rewrote the rules. Humor helped here as well. People joked about the gods being bad accountants, unable to tell the difference between a real child and a doll made of twigs. Or they teased each other, "Careful, if you misbehave, the spirits might settle for your goat instead." Laughter made the substitutions stick, easing the fear that abandoning the harsher rituals might anger the gods. Eventually, the memory of actual child sacrifices faded into legend. People whispered about ancestors who had done terrible things in darker times, but the present was safer, kinder. Rituals remained, but they were transformed. Smoke still rose into the sky. Chants still echoed through the night, but the victims were symbolic. The gods, if they existed, still received their offerings, and the people still felt the relief of control. But the tribe's children survived, grew, and carried the community forward. That's how humanity changes, not with sudden revolutions, but with countless tiny decisions. Parents holding their children tighter, hunters offering animals instead, storytellers weaving myths that eased the burden, and always, the slow whisper of doubt turning into quiet conviction. Maybe let's not do this anymore. So, as you rest tonight, imagine the shift. Fires still burning, chants still rising, but the cries of children replaced by the bleating of goats or the crackle of straw dolls. The tribe's grief softens, hope grows, and slowly, painfully, the darkest ritual of all is left behind. Humanity steps forward, not with grand speeches, but with the gentle, stubborn refusal to keep repeating what hurt too much to bear. Rituals have never been fixed in stone. Even if some of them were performed with stones in hand, they evolved, shifting with the needs of people, bending under the pressure of hunger, grief, and a slow but growing desire to make sense of life without constantly destroying the things they valued most. The story of rituals is the story of human compromise, a careful dance between fear of angering the unseen and the practical need to preserve life. At first, sacrifices were literal, life for life, blood for mercy. The logic was simple. If something bad happened, you must give up something precious to make it stop. When lightning split the sky, or the herds vanished over the horizon, the tribe thought, what can we give to keep this from happening again? The earliest offerings were food, animals, and, in the darkest chapters, even people. But the cost was devastating. Families mourned, tribes weakened. Each sacrifice cut not only into resources, but into the very future of the group. Over generations, that weight became unbearable. Parents clung to children, hunters resisted, giving up prime cuts of meat, and whispers of dissent began to stir. But the rituals could not simply vanish. To abandon them would feel like inviting catastrophe. So humanity did what it always does. When trapped between belief and necessity, it found workarounds. Symbolic offerings were the first step. Instead of giving up a child, perhaps a doll carved from wood or bound from twigs could stand in. Instead of slaughtering the strongest animal, perhaps its bones or a strip of hide could be burned. At first, these substitutions may have been risky. People probably whispered nervously as they dropped a figurine into the flames, watching the sky to see if the spirits noticed. And when the rains came anyway, when the herds returned, when the storm passed, relief spread like fire through dry grass. The spirits, it seemed, were satisfied with the gesture. Animals became the favored substitutes, easier to part with than children, less ruinous to the tribe's future than killing a healthy adult. Goats, sheep, birds, creatures that could be spared without unraveling the group's survival, took the place of humans. Their blood flowed into the earth, their smoke curled into the sky, and people convinced themselves the spirits had accepted the trade. Over time, this became standard, and the darker memories faded into whispered warnings of the old days. Even animals, however, became costly in lean years, and so the rituals continued to evolve, inching closer to pure symbolism. Offerings of grain, of carved figures, of firewood. People discovered that the act itself, the performance of the ritual, was more important than the actual thing offered. The gods, they reasoned, must care more about respect than about the meal itself. This was a crucial step, a softening of the harsh edge of sacrifice. And then came ritual acts, without any physical offering at all. Chants, dances, prayers, smoke wafting into the sky. Instead of spilling blood, people spilled words. Instead of burning children, they burned incense. Instead of loss, they gave time, energy, devotion. The sacrifice was no longer a life, but an action, a moment set aside to show reverence. Humor likely smoothed this transition. Imagine a tribe performing a ritual with a wooden doll. Someone whispering, "Well, at least it doesn't cry as much as the real thing." Or an elder sighing in relief. The gods must finally be going vegetarian. These jokes gave people permission to accept the changes, to see that their world didn't collapse without blood. Slowly, laughter replaced grief at the fire. The evolution of rituals mirrored the evolution of humanity itself. As people learned more about the natural world, as they saw patterns in seasons and animal migrations, the need for extreme sacrifices faded. The unseen was still powerful, still mysterious, but it no longer demanded the destruction of what people cherished most. Symbolism became enough, and in symbolism, rituals gained new strength. They could be performed more often, more joyfully, with less fear. So, as you close your eyes, imagine this shift. Fires still burning, chants still echoing, but the offerings, lighter dolls, bones, grain, smoke. The tribe still felt the comfort of tradition, still believed in their connection to the spirits, but without the unbearable cost. Rituals had changed, softened, and in doing so, they allowed humanity to step forward into a future where survival and belief could coexist without constant sacrifice. The gods were still fed, but the people finally kept their children. Echoes of these rituals live on in myths from later cultures. Echoes softened and reshaped until they no longer looked like their bloody beginnings. By the time humanity had moved into larger societies, with temples, cities, and the beginnings of written language, the raw brutality of sacrifice had often been replaced with stories, symbols, and traditions that carried the memory without the horror. Take the myth of Abraham in later traditions, told in deserts far from the icy plains of early humanity. A father asked to sacrifice his son, but stopped at the last moment, replaced with a ram. To believers, it was a story of obedience and divine mercy. But beneath it lies a much older echo, the memory of a time when children really were sacrificed, and the immense relief when that practice was replaced by animals. The myth preserves the moment of transition, sanctifying the shift from human life to symbolic offering. In Greece, myths told of kings who sacrificed daughters to calm the winds or appease gods before battle. In the Americas, stories of maize gods giving their own blood explained the cycles of crops. In India, hymns spoke of cosmic sacrifices, gods cutting themselves open to give life to the world. Everywhere, across every culture, myths wrapped the memory of sacrifice in narrative, turning horror into allegory. By the time these stories were written, the rituals themselves had largely changed. Instead of blood, people poured wine. Instead of flesh, they offered bread or grain. Instead of fire devouring children, incense smoke rose gently into the sky. The gods still received their offerings, but the offerings had become echoes, gentle, symbolic reminders of the brutal past. Humor even peeks through some of these traditions. Ancient comedies poked fun at priests who burned too much incense, choking the congregation. Festivals became lively parades, with music, masks, and laughter replacing the old, tense silence of sacrifice. What once was grief became celebration, as if humanity had collectively decided, we're done crying over rituals, let's dance instead. But the seriousness remained, woven into the myths. These traditions reminded people of their place in the universe, of the need to respect forces larger than themselves. The stories softened the sharp edge of sacrifice but preserved its lesson. Life is fragile, and something must always be given to keep balance. The something, however, no longer had to be blood. It could be time, devotion, ritual words, or symbolic gifts. As you drift now, imagine the long chain of memory. A mother weeping in a frozen hut as her child is taken for sacrifice. Generations later, a priest lifting a lamb. Centuries later, a loaf of bread broken in ritual. And today, perhaps a candle lit in silence. The actions have softened, the symbols grown gentler, but the echo remains. Myths carry the memory forward, not as horror, but as story, as tradition, as something people can live with. And maybe, hidden in those echoes, the gods themselves, if they exist, are relieved too. Relieved that humanity finally learned to honor them with song and laughter, with smoke and stories, instead of tears and blood. The legacy of those early rituals, the sacrifices, the substitutions, the whispered doubts, is not simply a grim curiosity tucked away in the attic of human history. It tells us something profound about who we are when the world presses hardest against us. Extreme pressure, whether it's an ice age, famine, or the endless unknown forces humanity to reveal both its sharpest edges and its deepest resilience. When we look back at tribes who chose sacrifices, even ones so unbearable as children, it's tempting to recoil and say, that's monstrous, and, in a sense, it island. But it is also evidence of a species refusing to surrender. Rather than lying down and letting the cold erase them, they fought back in the only way they knew, with rituals, with symbols, with the logic of desperation. That fight, the refusal to be passive in the face of annihilation, is part of our inheritance. It's the same instinct that pushes us today, though we wield it differently. Extreme pressure also revealed our ability to adapt. The shift from human sacrifices to symbolic offerings was not just kindness blooming from nowhere, it was practicality, shaped by grief and necessity. Humans learned that rituals could survive without destroying what mattered most. That lesson, painfully earned, shows how even under crushing fear, people found ways to evolve their beliefs. They didn't abandon the framework, they rewired it. And that act of rewiring under pressure is the foundation of so much of human progress. There's humor in this legacy too. Imagine the first tribe that tried swapping a baby for a goat, nervously waiting for lightning to strike them down, only to discover that nothing happened, except that dinner smelled a little better. One can almost hear the relieved laughter, the awkward jokes about gods preferring goat stew to human tears. It must have been an enormous weight lifted, one that slowly spread into cultural memory as stories of the old way became cautionary tales rather than active rituals. Even in tragedy, humanity managed to laugh its way towards survival. The legacy also reveals how humans crave meaning when chaos surrounds them. When storms buried the land in snow and hunger gnawed, rituals made the world feel less random. They gave people a story in which they had a role, not just victims of nature, but participants in a cosmic conversation. Even if the conversation was one-sided, even if the spirits never answered, the act of speaking gave courage, and courage, under pressure, is as vital as food. Perhaps most telling of all is that rituals weren't only about bargaining with gods. They were about unity. A tribe gathered around a fire, chanting, offering, grieving together, was a tribe that endured another day. Shared ritual was shared purpose. It turned unbearable pressure into collective effort. Alone, no one could stand against the climate monster. Together, with rituals binding them, people held on. That communal instinct to survive, not as individuals, but as groups, may be the single, strongest legacy of all. So when we ask what these rituals say about humans under extreme pressure, the answer is paradoxical. They say, we are capable of horror, but also capable of transformation. That we can endure grief, but also reshape it into resilience. That we will do foolish, desperate, even comical things when survival is at stake. But out of those fumbling acts can come innovation, cooperation, and meaning. The legacy is messy, uncomfortable, sometimes laughable, but it is also undeniable. It says that when the pressure mounts, humanity refuses to quit, even if the tools we use look strange to future eyes. And as you breathe slowly now, wrapped in your own comfort, that legacy hums in your blood. You are here because of people who endured impossible pressure, who invented rituals, who stumbled through mistakes, who laughed and cried, and somehow found ways to keep the fire alive. That is their gift, and their mark upon you. Now the story softens, like embers dimming after a long night. The rituals, the sacrifices, the storms, all those struggles belong to a time long past. You, lying in your bed, are their echo, but you are also something entirely different. Where they huddled in smoke-filled huts, you have walls that keep out the wind. Where they feared the fire dying, you have warmth at the turn of a dial. Where they sacrificed in terror, you can simply close your eyes and know that morning will come without pleading to the sky. This is the soothing truth. You are safe. The climate monster no longer prowls outside your door. The predators are not circling the camp. The rituals have softened into stories, into traditions that carry no blood. You are the descendant of survivors, but you are also free from their desperation. Their struggles gave you this gift, the ability to rest without fear. Gratitude flows easily when you think of it this way. Every comfort you feel, the pillow beneath your head, the blanket warming your shoulders, the quiet hum of your room, is the triumph of thousands of generations who faced storms and hunger so you would not have to. They whispered, they doubted, they learned, and because of that, you can lie here now in peace. It's almost funny, in a gentle way, to think of how far we've come, from tossing charred offerings into flames, to brushing your teeth and scrolling on your phone before sleep, from chanting at the sky to yawning under soft lamplight. The gods they feared would demand blood would probably be baffled, and maybe even a little impressed by how cozy you are tonight. So as you drift into sleep, let yourself breathe in that gratitude. Let the old fears fall away, knowing they belong to another world. Your world is safer, softer, kinder. There is no ritual to perform, no sacrifice to make. Just the simple act of letting go, of closing your eyes, of trusting the night to carry you gently into dreams. The fire is eternal now, built into the walls of your home. The tribe is vast, stretched across billions of people, yet you carry their legacy quietly in your chest. Rest then. Rest with the knowledge that you are safe, that you are the continuation of their story, but also the proof that humanity can turn horror into comfort, fear into laughter, chaos into peace. The night outside is calm. The warmth around you is real, and the only ritual left is the simplest one of all: sleep. And now, it's time to let your eyes grow heavy, to let your breath settle into an easy rhythm, and to drift gently into sleep. You've walked through ancient fires, through storms, through rituals, and you've arrived here safe, warm, and ready to rest. Sleep well, dream deeply, and wake renewed. But if you're still awake, you can wander into another story. Just click one of the 2 videos glowing on your screen. And before you drift too far, don't forget to subscribe, so you'll always have a place to return when the night calls for another tale.